Yeah, so I kind of think that people who advocated free trade, and including China joining the WTO, I think that when you really look at the literature, I think that they really recognize that there are going to be some winners and losers, but that there was this perhaps naive, but there was the belief that the winners would still compensate the losers.
Hmm.
And so I kind of think that what's happened is that the what I would say is this unwritten social contract was broken. That in the late 70s, the uh, we were in a crisis. We had some of that economists that couldn't happen. That is very weak, stagnant economies and high inflation. And how did we solve that? And that's where Reagan and Thatcher come along. And partly it was breaking that social contract. And that social contract, the base of that social contract was that wages would keep pace with inflation or productivity. That was the underlying basis of it. And I think that the social contract broke. And at the same time that they broke the social, so for me, I would say the story was really capital went on the offensive, trying to get out of that crisis of the 70s, and they went on this advance, this offensive, deregulate the capital markets, letting capital move around the world, deregulate. There used to be an interest rate cap in the U.S.
Right.
Get rid of that, and at the same time weaken organized labor. And I think so to me, it's not that China got into the WTO, it's that the Americans, but other countries too, you see say the Gini ratio, this
Hmm.
income distribution,
Yeah, quickly. Yeah.
became more skewed in most of the advanced industrialized countries. But I think that's because of political decisions made more than making room at the table for China. I mean, I think about it's fortunate our generation hasn't had to have a global war. But what was a World War I? And maybe some historians now these days they talk about the Great War. Partly, what was that about? It wasn't just about sort of the story that there's a subtext to what we've probably been told, and that subtext is who is going to replace the UK as the hegemonic power in the world. And was it going to be Germany and the U.S. roughly were passing up the U.K. say steel production or railroad mileage land, laid. We're replacing Germany and we're replacing the U.K. And so it's a question of where, who's going to be the next hegemonic power. And I think that by not making room at the table, which I think is sort of where we so end of World War One, can we make room for the table for a defeated Germany? And I think Keynes's economic consequences of peace, I think, is very relevant today as we think about how and what we demand from Russia for ending the war. Do we confiscate their reserves and repurpose them? Uh, do we bleed Russia the way that Keynes thought that we were going to bleed Germany? And I'm like, so within this context then of again back to the U.S. and this breaking the social contract domestically, that so we can have free trade, we can make room at the table for China if we have strong domestic institutions and politics that allow for this. But I don't think that's the case, and so I think that leaves the middle class and working class very vulnerable to these shifting tides. Uh, but I'm not sure that I mean, that this globalization is really the key here. I mean, I think about like Adam Smith writes the book, right? We're all familiar with The Wealth of Nations, and
Hmm.
he takes people through a tour of a pin factory to really illustrate the division of labor. And Keynes writes about, as a British man of his age, how he can order things from all around the world and have them delivered in the UK. Now, Milton Friedman did it with his wife, Rose Friedman. They took people through the manufacture of pencil, the global division of labor. I think that people in the United States, uh, they benefit greatly from having cheap products produced overseas. It helps us combat when our bosses aren't giving us raises. It helps keep the American standard of living that we could acquire things, buy things, part of this American dream, cheaper than we could otherwise. And I think that many people say, well, China shouldn't have joined the WTO. That was like the Trojan horse. if you will. I think that we don't think about the next step. What would have the world been like? It wouldn't have just been status quo. China still would have been growing, expanding, perhaps without the guidelines, even as mild as they are, of the WTO. Now, I think that this globalization is what we think of globalization is very much of an American creation. Foreign direct investment, McDonald's in Red Square. McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or Starbucks in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. This is what I think we mean by globalization. That's so peculiar to America: fast food. And I think that we can have it. We should be able to be creative enough, imaginative enough to imagine another type of globalization, the type of globalization that our grandparents had. People didn't have visas and passports. Global migration, people moved at huge numbers, and now we're sort of choking on them. And it's been, of course, a political issue in the U.S., political issues in Europe about immigration and refugees. There's different types of globalization. We've had other types of globalization, but I think that some of the you think about what's happened, say, roughly 1950 to roughly 2000. This globalization was lifted. I mean, world GDP. You think about even in China, this access to global markets, GDP per capita went up something on the magnitude of 8 to 10-fold in China from, say, 1980 to 2000. The abject poverty, I mean, in some ways, I would suggest it would not. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule in big parts of Africa, parts of South America, parts of East Asia, and even parts, very rural parts in America where don't have access to electricity. But the kind of penetration rate of cell phones, for example, is just incredible. The penetration of computers. So a lot of these technologies that came about because of the liberalization of the capital markets. I think about like the breaking up of AT&T. The internet might be hard to conceptualize if the AT&T monopoly wasn't broken up. And so I want to say that in the sort of tradition of Marx, Marx argued that he hated capitalism, but he also recognized that it was the best system up to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that like this whole deglobalization debate is a little bit kind of misunderstood because it's just becoming a little bit more strategic, as you said, right? It's just like it's not only capital that's deciding what's best. Doesn't matter if people, capital moves, these kind of trade policies, but it's really about there's like a bigger layer of decision making that now comes into play as well, which makes everything just a little bit more strategic, which will have effects, but like we are not going back. So
yeah, I think that maybe what you're getting at is it's almost like a gravity model that instead of thinking about globalization as if it's evenly distributed around the world, think about like strong regions. Like in the U.S., for example, the West Coast and the East Coast, a few hundred miles on each side of the country, that produces an incredible percentage of our GDP. And so it's not globalization. I mean, the interior of Brazil might not be so integrated in the global economy. The southern part of Mexico might not be, but the northern part is. And so you look, I think that we might find that globalization was always really about regionalization. And now to your point, it becomes more thoughtful about why it is that way.